You're sitting in a cold interrogation room, your hands trembling not from fear of the law, but from the memories of that cursed day. The detective across from you patiently waits for you to speak. But how can you explain the unexplainable? How do you talk about things that defy human understanding? You're ready to cooperate, ready to tell every last detail, but you're afraid they won't believe you. Afraid they'll think you're insane. Though perhaps you really have lost your mind after everything you've been through. It all started in New Harbor, where you'd been living for the past 3 years. You worked as a manager at a small tech company, rented a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bayview district, and led an ordinary, unremarkable life. But then they entered your life, the people you now simply call the very bad ones. You won't go into detail about how it happened, just that it began innocently. A small side gig, some extra cash that seemed like easy money. You were naive, thinking you could control the situation, that you could always get out of the game whenever you wanted. You were wrong. By the time you realized what you'd gotten yourself into, it was too late. These people weren't kidding. They played by their own rules, cruel and merciless. You saw what they did to those who tried to cheat or betray them. You saw it, and that sight still haunts your nightmares. When it became clear your life was hanging by a thread, you made the only correct decision: to run. Run far and long until they forgot about you or found more important things to do. On that February evening, you packed only the essentials: documents, a little money, warm clothes. You left your apartment, your job, your friends, your entire old life. You bought a ticket for the first train heading east. It didn't matter where, just away from New Harbor, away from them. In the car, you sat huddled in your seat, and every time the doors opened, your heart stopped with fear. You thought they'd find you even here. Even on this rattling train carrying you into the unknown. You traveled for a long time, several days, making transfers in different cities, crisscrossing the country like a hunted animal. Money dwindled, and with it the hope of starting a new life somewhere far away. Eventually, you realized the only way out was to return to where you grew up, to relatives who might help you weather the difficult times. Your hometown greeted you with a gray March sky and a biting wind that chilled you to the bone, but even here, disappointment awaited. Your parents had passed away several years ago, and relations with your other relatives were strained. Your uncle, whom you went to first, didn't even let you through the door. He said he'd heard about your dealings in New Harbor and wanted nothing to do with it. How he found out you still don't understand, but the fact remains. Even here in your hometown, you were an outcast. For 2 days you wandered the streets, sleeping in the train station and stairwells, eating whatever you could buy in cheap diners. Despair came in waves. It seemed there was no way out, that you were doomed to a life on the streets. And then you remembered Aunt Bethany, your grandmother's second cousin who lived in a small village 20 miles from the city. You'd only seen her a few times as a child, but she'd always seemed like a kind and welcoming woman. Maybe she wouldn't refuse help. Maybe she'd let you stay the night and gather yourself. You spent your last money on a ticket to this village. The bus rattled for a long time over a broken road. Outside the windows, bare fields and sparse villages flashed by. The farther you drove from the city, the more dismal the landscape became. The March sun beat down, but it offered no warmth, only emphasizing the grayness and lifelessness of the surrounding world. The other passengers were silent, lost in their thoughts, and only the steady hum of the engine broke the quiet. The village you arrived at was even more depressing than you expected. A few dozen houses scattered along a single street, most of them looking abandoned. The general store, the post office, the town hall, all huddled in one dilapidated Soviet-era building. There were almost no people on the streets. Only occasionally did silhouettes flicker behind windows or in yards. The place seemed perfect for hiding out and waiting until things calmed down in New Harbor. You found Aunt Bethany's house without difficulty. The locals readily gave directions. It stood on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by a tall, corrugated metal fence. The house itself looked sturdy, two-story brick, with a wide veranda and large windows. It was clear the owner kept things tidy. The yard was swept clean, the paths covered with sand. Even in the March grayness, everything looked neat and well-maintained. You stood for a long time at the gate, steeling yourself. Words you intended to say, explanations and requests, swirled in your head. How do you talk about your problems without revealing the whole truth? How do you ask for help from someone you barely know? But there was no choice. This was your last chance, your last hope for finding some kind of refuge. Finally, you decided and pressed the doorbell. For a long time, no one answered, and you began to think Aunt Bethany wasn't home. But then you heard footsteps, the creak of floorboards, and the door opened. Standing before you was an elderly woman, about 70, short, full-figured, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was kind, though tired, her eyes gray, attentive. She looked at you with bewilderment, trying to understand who you were and what you wanted. You introduced yourself, reminded her of your relation, and briefly explained your problems without going into detail. You said you had to leave New Harbor due to family circumstances, that you were temporarily without a home and job, and asked if you could stay the night. Aunt Bethany listened carefully, nodding from time to time, her face expressing sympathy and understanding. In the end, she smiled and invited you in, saying she was happy to help a relative in need. The inside of the house surprised me with its cleanliness and order. The entryway was small but cozy, a wooden coat rack, neatly arranged shoes, a spotless rug. Everything spoke of a meticulous and tidy owner. Aunt Bethany led me into the living room, where a massive oak table in the center immediately caught my eye. On it stood an antique grandfather clock, tall, almost human-sized, with a carved casing and a gilded face. The clock ticked steadily and loudly, its sound filling the entire room, creating a unique atmosphere of regularity and peace. The furniture in the living room was sturdy but old, a relic of a bygone era. A sofa with worn upholstery, a floor-to-ceiling bookcase filled with volumes of classic literature, a dresser with framed photographs. Paintings hung on the walls, landscapes and still lifes painted in oil, seemingly by the owner herself. All of it created the feeling of a home where time had stopped decades ago, where life flowed slowly and measuredly, obeying its own internal rhythms. Aunt Bethany bustled in the kitchen preparing tea. I sat at the table and surveyed the interior, trying to calm down after all the turmoil I'd been through. Here, in this quiet living room, to the steady ticking of the clock, it seemed all my problems were far away, in another life. For the first time in many days, I felt something akin to peace. Perhaps here I truly could rest and collect myself. The hostess returned with a tray holding cups, a teapot, and a plate of cookies. She poured the tea, strong, aromatic, warming both soul and body. We sat opposite each other, and Aunt Bethany asked me about my life, my work, and how other relatives were doing. I answered evasively, not going into the details of my troubles. I spoke in general terms about the difficulties of modern life, about needing a change of scenery sometimes to sort things out. She listened attentively, nodding, occasionally interjecting her own comments about how the world had changed, how hard it was for ordinary people to live. She talked about her life in the village, about her neighbors, about her household. It turned out she had lived alone for many years. Her husband had died, they had no children, and her only remaining relatives were distant ones who rarely visited. She spoke about it calmly, without self-pity, as something natural and inevitable. The conversation flowed slowly and casually. Aunt Bethany turned out to be an interesting conversationalist, well-read, observant, with a subtle sense of humor. She told amusing stories from village life, shared memories of her youth, and asked about modern technologies she didn't understand herself. I gradually relaxed, feeling the tension of the past few days recede, feeling my ability to think and speak normally return. Time passed imperceptibly. We finished the first pot of tea, and Aunt Bethany brewed a second. Dusk gathered outside the window and the house grew cozier. The hostess turned on a table lamp with a lampshade. A soft light spread through the room, creating an intimate atmosphere of homey warmth. It felt as if we could sit like this for hours in no hurry, enjoying simple human connection. But then something strange happened. It was around 9 in the evening when those antique clocks on the table began to chime. The first strike sounded as usual, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the room. The second, the third. With each strike, I noticed Aunt Bethany's face change. The warm smile that had been on her face all evening gradually disappeared. Her eyes became more serious, even stern. By the 7th strike, her face was completely stony, almost hostile. The 9th strike sounded particularly loud, and Aunt Bethany sharply rose from the table. Her movements became precise, swift, completely unlike the unhurried fussiness I had observed before. She went to the dresser, took out a sheet of paper and a pen from a drawer, returned to the table and began to write something. She wrote intently, occasionally looking up and staring intently at me. There was something in her gaze that made me shiver and avert my eyes. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but Aunt Bethany gestured for me to be silent. She continued writing, carefully forming each letter. The atmosphere in the room had drastically changed. From cozy and homely, it became tense, even sinister. The ticking of the clock now seemed not soothing, but menacing. Each sound echoed in my temples, creating a sense of impending danger. Finally, Aunt Bethany finished writing. She neatly folded the sheet in half, then in half again, and handed it to me. There was no trace of the kindness I had seen on her face just minutes ago. Now it was the face of a strict, unyielding woman who tolerated no objections. Her voice sounded completely different, dry, official, devoid of any warmth. She said that her house had its rules that every guest must follow. That these rules had been developed over years and could not be broken under any circumstances. That not only the peace in the house, but also the safety of everyone within it, depended on their strict observance. She uttered the last words especially clearly, looking directly into my eyes, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I took the sheet with trembling hands and unfolded it. What I read there shocked me. These were not just rules of hospitality. It was an entire system of prohibitions and restrictions written in small, neat handwriting. The rules concerned literally every aspect of staying in the house, from waking up time to ways of moving between rooms. The first rule stated that from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning it was strictly forbidden to leave the bedroom that would be assigned to me. Under no circumstances, even if there was a fire or another emergency. The second rule prohibited opening any doors in the house after 10 in the evening, except the door to my own bedroom. The third, not to talk to anyone after the specified time, even if someone knocked on the door or called my name. Then came even stranger restrictions. It was forbidden to leave dirty dishes in the sink. Everything had to be washed and put away by 10 in the evening. It was forbidden to turn on water in the bathroom and toilet at night. It was forbidden to look out the windows after dark. It was forbidden to turn on the light in the hallway and on the stairs. The list went on and on, each item more absurd than the last. The last rule particularly struck me. It was written in red ink and underlined twice. It stated that if I heard any sounds at night, footsteps, voices, knocking, scratching, or anything else, I was to close my eyes, cover my ears, and repeat a prayer or any text I knew well to myself until the sounds stopped. Under no circumstances was I to try to find the source of these sounds. I looked up from the sheet and at Aunt Bethany. She sat motionless, her arms crossed over her chest, carefully observing my reaction. In her eyes I saw not a drop of sympathy or understanding, only cold determination. It was clear she took these rules absolutely seriously and expected the same from me. I tried to ask why all these restrictions were necessary, what they meant, but Aunt Bethany only shook her head. She said there would be no explanations, only a choice. Accept the rules and stay or leave the house right now. No compromises or exceptions. Her voice sounded so uncompromising that I knew arguing was useless. The situation was a stalemate. On one hand, these rules seemed like the ramblings of a crazy old woman, and any sane person should have turned around and left. On the other hand, I had nowhere to go. It was getting colder outside, my money was gone, and there were no other options for a place to stay. Besides, I thought, what's wrong with sleeping one night in a warm bed, even if it means obeying these strange whims of an old woman? Aunt Bethany waited for my answer, her gaze fixed on me. The house was completely silent, broken only by the ticking of that cursed clock. Every second stretched into an eternity, and I still couldn't make a final decision. Reason said one thing, circumstances another. But the cold outside and exhaustion took their toll. Finally, I nodded and said I agreed to abide by her rules. Aunt Bethany smiled with satisfaction, but this smile was completely different, unlike the warm smiles she had greeted me with. It was the smile of someone who had gotten what they wanted, who had achieved complete obedience. There was something predatory, triumphant about it. She stood up and showed me the way to the second floor where the room she had assigned me was located. We climbed a creaky wooden staircase, lit only by the faint light from the chandelier below. On the second floor was a long corridor with several doors. Aunt Bethany opened one of them and turned on the light. The room was small but clean and cozy. A single bed with crisp white linens, a small desk, a chair, a closet. An icon hung on the wall and a nightlight stood beside the bed. Everything was prepared for a guest. A towel, soap, even slippers were placed next to the bed. A typical guest room, nothing special. Aunt Bethany reminded me of the rules again, particularly emphasizing the importance of observing the time restrictions. She said breakfast would be at 7 in the morning and wished me good night. As she closed the door, she added that the room key was hanging on a nail on the inside, and I could lock myself in if I felt more secure. Left alone, I sat on the bed for a while and reread the list of rules. In the light of the desk lamp, they seemed even more absurd. What was this nonsense about not turning on water at night? Why couldn't I look out the windows? And what kind of sounds could be heard in the house at night if only an elderly woman lived here? But exhaustion was taking its toll. It had been a difficult day, full of stress and worry. I just wanted to lie in a clean bed and fall asleep and worry about everything else tomorrow. Especially since the rules mainly concern nighttime, and until morning I could just sleep and not worry about anything. I undressed, washed up in the small basin in the corner of the room, and lay down in bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable. A soft mattress, fresh linens, a warm blanket. After several nights on train station benches and in stairwells, this felt like a luxury. I turned off the light and closed my eyes, hoping to fall asleep quickly. But sleep wouldn't come. An unaccustomed silence filled the house, broken only by the distant ticking of the clock downstairs. Occasionally, the floorboards creaked. Presumably, Aunt Bethany was preparing for bed. Then even those sounds stopped, and a complete, oppressive silence fell. I lay there thinking about what had happened, about the strange change in the hostess's behavior, about her rules. The more I pondered, the more anxious I became. Something was wrong in this house, something I couldn't yet understand but felt in every fiber of my being. Time crawled agonizingly slow. I lay in bed listening to every sound, every creak of the old house. The clock downstairs continued its measured count, tick-tock, tick-tock, and the sound slowly began to grate on my nerves. It seemed to grow louder, more insistent, penetrating through the walls and floorboards, filling the entire room with its mechanical rhythm. I tried to fall asleep, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. I tossed and turned, sometimes pulling the blanket over my head, sometimes throwing it off, burying my face in the pillow, changing positions. Nothing helped. My mind stubbornly refused to shut down, continuing to analyze the day's events, searching for logical explanations for Aunt Bethany's strange behavior. But the more I thought, the less I understood. Midnight struck. 12 chimes echoed through the house, reverberating through the corridors and rooms. After the last strike, such a silence fell that I could hear my own heartbeat. Even ordinary night sounds, the rustle of wind outside the window, the creak of settling beams, seemed unnaturally loud in this dead quiet. More time passed. I still couldn't fall asleep, lying with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The moon outside shone brightly, its light penetrating the thin curtains and creating strange patterns of shadows on the walls. Sometimes these shadows moved with the swaying of the curtains, and then it seemed as if figures were moving around the room. Around 1 in the morning, I felt an urgent need to use the bathroom. I tried to ignore the sensation, recalling one of Aunt Bethany's rules about not turning on the water at night. But the need became more and more insistent, turning into real torment. I remembered seeing the bathroom door at the end of the corridor when I went upstairs. I fought with myself for another 20 minutes, but in the end, I couldn't hold out. I thought that if I was careful, if I didn't turn on the light or make noise, nothing bad would happen. Rules are rules, but a person's natural needs are more important than the whims of an eccentric old woman. Besides, she was probably fast asleep in her room on the first floor and wouldn't hear my cautious footsteps. I got out of bed, fumbling for my slippers in the dark. The room door opened almost silently. I turned the handle slowly and carefully, trying not to make the slightest creak. I peered into the corridor. It was plunged into darkness. Only a faint moonlight fell through a window at the far end, creating a barely noticeable patch on the floor. I walked down the corridor, trying to step as quietly as possible. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but not too loudly. The old house lived its own life, making familiar sounds: wood crackling somewhere, wind whistling in a chimney somewhere, water dripping somewhere. All of this created a background of ordinary household noises in which my cautious steps were drowned out and became indistinguishable. I reached the bathroom, carefully opened the door. The room was tiny: a toilet, a small sink, a narrow window near the ceiling. Moonlight barely penetrated here, but my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the basic contours. I relieved myself, trying to make as little noise as possible, and was about to leave when something happened that turned my entire life upside down. I leaned over the toilet to lower the lid, and suddenly I saw something long and pale slowly beginning to rise from the water. First, the tips of fingers appeared, thin, unnaturally long, with nails more like claws. Then came a hand, a wrist, a forearm. The skin on the arm was a sickly beige color, like a corpse that had been lying in water for several days. I froze in horror, unable to move or scream. The arm continued to rise, bending at impossible angles. The fingers twitched, flexing and extending as if trying to feel for something in the air. Dark spots like lividity were visible on the skin, and some kind of black liquid oozed from beneath the nails. When the hand had almost fully emerged, the fingers suddenly clenched into a fist, then slowly unfurled, turning the palm towards me. On the palm I saw a mouth, a real human mouth with lips, teeth, and a tongue. The lips moved, trying to say something, but there was no sound, only a silent movement that looked even more chilling than any scream. Finally, the stupor passed, and I recoiled from the toilet. The hand immediately began to withdraw back into the water, its fingers frantically grasping at the edges of the toilet, trying to hold on, but gradually disappearing into the dark water. The last to disappear was the index finger, which continued to bend and twitch to the very end like a living worm. I burst out of the bathroom, forgetting all precautions. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it could be heard throughout the house. My hands trembled, my legs barely held me. What I had just seen defied all logic. It couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination, anything but reality. But deep down, I knew it was real. I had seen every detail too clearly: the skin texture, the shape of the nails, the movement of the lips on the palm. I had felt the smell emanating from that hand too realistically. The smell of decay, dampness, something dead and decomposing. My brain refused to accept this reality, but my body reacted instinctively. Adrenaline surged through my blood, muscles tensed to their limit, ready to flee. I reached my room, locked the door, and leaned my back against it. I breathed quickly and shallowly, trying to calm down, to gather my thoughts. I told myself it was a nightmare, that I had dozed off and had a horrible dream. But my hands still trembled, and that disgusting smell still lingered in my nostrils. I sat on the bed and picked up the sheet with the rules. In the light of the nightlight, I reread them again, and now they no longer seemed like the whims of a crazy old woman. Now they looked like instructions for survival, a code of laws, the violation of which could lead to something terrible. I had broken one of them, left the room after 10 in the evening, and immediately encountered something unimaginable. I tried to find a logical explanation for what I had seen. Maybe there was some pipe system in the house that created illusions. Maybe Aunt Bethany was involved in some kind of theatrical performances, setting up mechanical devices for pranks. But the more I thought about it, the more absurd these explanations seemed. The clock struck 2. I was still sitting on the bed, hugging my knees, trying to calm my nerves. A dead silence filled the house. Even the usual night sounds that had been heard before had ceased. It was like the silence of a graveyard, heavy and oppressive. Suddenly I heard a sound that defied description. It was like the scraping of claws on metal, mixed with a wet squelch and gurgling moans. The sound approached, growing louder and more repulsive. Then I saw it. Some kind of white substance began to ooze from under the door. At first it was a thin stream, but gradually it widened, spreading across the floor of my room. The substance glowed with a faint, sickly light and moved not like a liquid, but like something alive. It pulsated, writhed, reaching out to me with tentacles and growths. As the white mass filled the room, outlines began to appear within it. At first vague, blurry, but gradually becoming clearer. These were parts of a human body, arms, legs, heads, torsos. But they were all misshapen, distorted, as if made of wax and melted by high heat. The white mass gathered in the center of the room and began to form a figure. A tall, thin figure with disproportionately long limbs. It had a human face, but its eyes were completely white, without pupils, and its mouth stretched to its ears, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The creature stood motionless and stared at me with those horrible white eyes. I knew I was about to lose consciousness. Reality had become unbearable. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. The last thing I remembered was the creature beginning to move towards me, making that very disgusting sound. Scraping, squelching, and moaning all at once. Then everything plunged into darkness. Consciousness returned slowly, as if I were surfacing from the depths of a dark ocean. First came individual sensations. Cold, the hardness of the floor beneath my back, a throbbing pain in the back of my head. Then smells, dust, dampness, something sour and unpleasant. And only then vision, blurry and indistinct, gradually focusing on the room's ceiling. I lay on the floor next to the bed. My head was splitting with pain. Apparently I had hit the edge of the bed or the floor when I fainted. There was a foul taste in my mouth, like after a long illness, and my body ached as if I had been beaten. Slowly, I pushed myself up on my elbows, looking around. The room looked normal. No trace of that white substance, no monstrous figures. Just an ordinary guest room in an old woman's house. My first thought was, it was all a dream. A nightmare caused by the stress of the past few days, by fears and anxieties, but when I tried to stand, I felt that my slippers were wet. I looked down and saw something sticky and whitish on the soles, resembling slime. This couldn't be a dream. This was real, tangible proof that the night's horrors had indeed occurred. I forced myself to stand, making my way to the sink in the corner of the room. My face in the mirror looked awful, pale with dark circles under my eyes, a frozen expression of horror. My hair was disheveled and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I looked like a person who had survived something unimaginable, something that had changed him forever. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to compose myself. The water was icy and helped me fully come to my senses. In my reflection, I saw my ability to think logically gradually return. I needed to understand what was happening, what forces were at play in this house, and most importantly, how to protect myself from them. I glanced at the clock. It was 6:30 in the morning, half an hour until breakfast. So I had been unconscious for several hours, from the appearance of that white creature until dawn. I wondered what had been happening in the house all that time. Where was this creature? Where had it disappeared to? And most importantly, did Aunt Bethany know what was happening in her house at night? The more I thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. Of course, she knew. Those rules she gave me were not the whims of a crazy old woman, but instructions for survival. She knew there was something horrible residing in the house, something that became active at night, and all those prohibitions were meant to protect against it. But then another question arose. Why did she live in such a house? Why hadn't she left, sold it, or sought help? Either she couldn't do it for some reason, or she herself was connected to these horrors. Perhaps she wasn't a victim but an accomplice. Perhaps these creatures obeyed her, served her. The thought made me shudder. If Aunt Bethany truly controlled these creatures, then I was in mortal danger. Last night I broke her rules and immediately encountered a nightmare. What would happen tonight? What would she do as punishment for my disobedience? I had to run, immediately while she was still asleep. Gather my things and leave this cursed house before it was too late. But when I went to the window and looked out, I realized it was impossible. It had snowed overnight, a lot of snow. The road to the village was covered. Buses were clearly not running. Even if I tried to walk, I would freeze in the first half hour. I was trapped in a house where things beyond human understanding happened at night, with a woman who was either insane or something far more dangerous. And the only thing I could do was pretend that nothing had happened and hope to survive until I could get out of here. I got dressed, tidied myself up as best I could. I went downstairs to the living room where Aunt Bethany was already setting the table. She looked the same as she had yesterday afternoon, a kindly old woman busy with household chores. Seeing me, she smiled and greeted me, asking how I had slept. There was no hint of irony or trickery in her voice, only genuine concern for her guest. I replied that I had slept well and thanked her for her hospitality. We sat down for breakfast. Porridge, scrambled eggs, fresh bread, aromatic tea. Simple food, prepared with care. Aunt Bethany asked about my plans, suggested I stay another day or two until bus service was restored. She said she was happy for the company, that she hadn't had a chance to talk to an intelligent person in a long time. All of this seemed so normal, so human, that I began to doubt the reality of the night's events. Maybe they really were nightmares. Maybe stress and exhaustion had led to hallucinations. This kind old woman thoughtfully serving me another helping of porridge simply did not fit the image of a mistress of nocturnal creatures. But as she handed me the tea, I noticed a small mark on her hand. Pale, almost imperceptible. It was the exact same color as the hand that had emerged from the toilet. And then, my last doubts vanished. It was her. She was connected to those horrors, perhaps even controlled them. And her daytime behavior was merely a mask she wore to deceive her guests. After breakfast, Aunt Bethany busied herself with household chores. I stayed in the living room pretending to read a book I had taken from the shelf. In reality, I was thinking about how to escape this situation. There was no phone in the house, cell service was non-existent, and the nearest neighbors were far away. I was completely isolated, cut off from the outside world. The day dragged on agonizingly slow. Aunt Bethany behaved like a normal hostess, cooking, cleaning, occasionally engaging me in casual conversation. But I noticed strange details. For example, how she avoided getting close to mirrors. There were several in the house, but she always skirted around them. Or how she flinched when a dog barked outside, sharply as if from a sudden blow. As evening approached, she began to change again. Just like the night before, the transformation began with the chiming of the clock, this time at 8. With each strike, her face grew sterner, her movements sharper. By the last chime, she was a completely different person, cold, authoritative, almost hostile. She approached me and asked if I had followed her rules yesterday. Her voice sounded metallic, her eyes bored into me. I tried to lie, to say that I had strictly followed all instructions. But she merely sneered, maliciously, triumphantly. She said she could smell the transgression, that the house itself had told her about my nocturnal trip to the bathroom. Then she began to describe what I had seen. She spoke of the hand in the toilet, the voice from the closet, the white creature. She spoke of all this with such detail that no one but an eyewitness could have known. And in her voice was not sympathy but satisfaction. She reveled in my fear, feeding on it. Then she informed me that tonight would be much worse. That breaking the rules does not go unpunished, that the creatures demand retribution, that the only way to avoid a horrible death was to offer myself as a sacrifice. Willingly, without resistance, as atonement for my guilt, she explained the procedure with sadistic pleasure. At midnight, I would have to go down to the basement where they would be waiting for me. There, a ritual would take place, as a result of which my life force would pass to them, and my body would become part of their world. She promised it wouldn't hurt too much if I didn't resist. Listening to all this, I realized that the being before me was not human. It was something else, something that only pretended to be human. Perhaps Aunt Bethany had once been an ordinary woman, but now something else lived in her body. Something ancient, malevolent, feeding on human suffering. She finished her explanations and rose from the table. She said that until midnight I could do whatever I wanted, eat, read, even try to run away if I wanted to freeze in the snow. But at midnight I absolutely had to go down to the basement. There was no alternative. The house would not let me out alive if I tried to break the agreement. When she went to the kitchen, I was left alone with my thoughts. The situation was hopeless. Attempting to escape in such weather was suicide. But staying meant a slow, agonizing death at the hands of unknown creatures. I had to find a third way, a possibility that this possessed old woman hadn't foreseen. I began to examine the house more carefully, looking for something that could help. In one of the dresser drawers, I found medical supplies. Apparently, Aunt Bethany suffered from some illness. Among other things, there was a rubber tourniquet for intravenous injections, long, strong, with metal clasps at the ends. The plan formed instantly. If what was currently in Aunt Bethany's body was not human, then it could be destroyed. And if it was still a person, then they were so dangerous that their destruction would be an act of self-defense. In any case, I had no other choice. I hid the tourniquet under my shirt and waited. Time dragged on endlessly. Aunt Bethany occasionally peered into the living room, checking if I was still there. Each time she looked at me with the same sadistic pleasure, like an executioner at the condemned. In her eyes danced the fires of anticipation. Around 11 in the evening, she came for the last time. She said that in an hour I would need to go down to the basement. She showed me the way, a door behind the kitchen leading down. She warned me not to try to escape or hide. The creatures would find me anyway, but then death would be much more painful. As she turned to leave, I acted. I snatched the tourniquet from under my shirt, looped it around her neck, and pulled it tight. She tried to scream, but only a gasp escaped her throat. She tried to claw at the tourniquet with her fingers, but I held tight, pulling the loop tighter and tighter. The struggle was short but furious. Aunt Bethany was stronger than I expected. She fought like a wild animal, scratching with her claws, trying to bite. But the element of surprise was on my side. Plus, I was younger and stronger. Gradually, her resistance weakened. Her movements became more sluggish. But the most terrifying thing began as she was dying. Her face began to change. Her skin turned gray. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, and black liquid began to flow from her mouth. And all this time, she made sounds. Not human, but some inhuman noises, like the hiss of a snake or the grinding of metal on stone. When she stopped moving, I released my hands and stepped back. Her body lay on the floor in an unnatural pose, but something continued to happen to it. Her skin became increasingly gray, then almost black. From various orifices, mouth, nose, ears, the same black liquid began to ooze, gradually spreading across the floor. Then the body began to dissolve, literally melting, turning into a thick, dark mass. The process was fast. Within minutes, nothing was left of Aunt Bethany but a puddle of black slime that emanated a disgusting smell of decay and sulfur. Even her clothes dissolved, leaving only the medical tourniquet lying in the center of the puddle. I stood staring at this mess, unable to believe what was happening. What had I just killed? A human or something else? And what would happen to me now? Would the nocturnal creatures disappear with the death of their mistress, or on the contrary, would they become enraged and even more dangerous? The answer was not long in coming. Something unimaginable began in the house. The walls shook as if in an earthquake. Dishes rattled in the cupboards, books fell from the shelves. From all the cracks, from under the baseboards, from outlets, from vents, the same white substance I had seen last night began to ooze. I knew I had to run immediately. I grabbed my jacket, burst out of the house into the snowstorm. The cold hit me like a hammer, but adrenaline gave me strength. I ran down the snow-covered road towards the village, sinking into snowdrifts, stumbling and falling. Behind me, the house glowed with an ominous white light. The same unnatural light streamed from the windows. I ran as long as I could. My legs sank into the snow, my clothes were soaked, but I couldn't stop. It felt as if something terrifying was chasing me from behind, that it would catch me and tear me apart at any moment. I looked back several times. The house was still glowing, but gradually the light grew dimmer. I reached the village at dawn, half dead from exhaustion and cold. I found the administration building, which housed a small police department. The duty officer at first thought I was drunk or insane. My story of monsters and dissolving corpses seemed too wild. But when several hours later a squad went to check Aunt Bethany's house, they found a strange scene. The house stood untouched, but there was no one inside. No signs of struggle, no traces of blood or that black goo. Only in the living room on the floor lay the medical tourniquet I had described in my testimony. The official version was simple. The elderly woman had gone somewhere, and the guest, in a state of nervous breakdown, had made up the whole story. But I knew the truth. I knew that something terrible resided in that house, that Aunt Bethany was either its victim or its servant. And now, after her death, these creatures were without control. That is why I am sitting here now, telling all this to the investigator. Not because I want to confess to murder. I didn't kill a human, I destroyed a monster. I am telling this because the house must be destroyed. Burned to the ground, the ruins covered with earth, a fence erected around it. Because what lives there must not break free. It must not find a new victim who will become its conduit into our world. Aunt Bethany's rules were not just whims. They were a barrier that held back an ancient evil. Now that barrier is gone, and only God knows what might happen. I broke the rules and I had to pay for it. But the main reckoning is still ahead. If you don't take action, if you don't isolate this house from people, then sooner or later someone else will go there. And then it will all happen again. But next time there may not be a person strong enough or desperate enough to fight back. I did everything I could. I told the truth, however unbelievable it may seem. Now it's up to you to believe me or to deem me insane. But remember, some houses contain more than just people. And some rules exist not to be broken, but to protect us from what is better left undisturbed.